How does America win this war? And what does a win even mean when President Trump's rationale for attacking Iran seems to shift every time he's in front of a microphone?
It's been mass terror, and we're not going to put up with it any longer. From Lebanon to Yemen and Syria to Iraq, the regime has armed, trained, and funded terrorist militias that have soaked the earth with blood and guts.
Will he achieve what 5 decades of previous US presidents have craved and end the Ayatollah's regime? Or will he be personally responsible for the worst US foreign policy mistake in the last half-century?
When we are finished, take over your government. It will be yours to take. Now is the time to seize control of your destiny and to unleash the prosperous and glorious future that is close within your reach.
Welcome to The General and the Journalist. I'm Tom in Austria.
And I'm Patrick, sadly not in Austria, but in London. So to help us with some of those questions, we are delighted to be talking with retired Admiral James Sandy Winnefeld. I think he's the highest ranking US officer we've ever had on the pod. Sandy was the vice chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, so that's the number 2 in the US defense establishment, from 2011 to 2015. That makes him the second most senior officer in the US Armed Forces. Sandy, welcome, and thanks for getting up so early for us.
Well, it's a great pleasure to be with you, and I'm sure we'll have a very interesting conversation.
I'm sure we will. I mean, you come from an extraordinary military dynasty. And the thing that really caught my eye was that your great-grandfather was a Prussian cavalryman. I mean, when was that? And was he involved in invading France or Germany at any stage?
I can't vouch for any military operations he participated in, but he was a Prussian cavalryman, and I've got pictures. I even have his sword, his spurs, and his epaulettes at home. And then his son, who was a very rebellious man, I can tell hilarious stories about him, ended up in World War II as a Navy enlisted man in the Pacific on a submarine tender. And then my father, who always viewed the Naval Academy as his surrogate parents, of course, went into the Navy. And of course, I have a son who's a Marine Corps officer right now.
So what was it that drew you into the Navy? I mean, there's obviously a degree of sort of familial habit, but was there a particular moment that inspired you?
There was that tickle of watching my father be a Navy pilot, and it seemed like it might be sort of fun. And then right before I went to college, we moved to Virginia Beach where F-14s were stationed. And I watched, as I was working a construction job, watched them flying around their landing pattern. And, it sort of looked like it might be a fun thing to do.
And of course, when most people think about naval aviation, they never really get much further than Top Gun. And I think you were an instructor at the Navy Fighter Weapons School. Was that at the time that they were filming Top Gun?
It actually was while they were filming Top Gun. It was fascinating to be involved in the movie, not so much because the flying scenes were great fun to fly. They were actually kind of boring compared to what we did on a day-to-day basis. But watching them make the film was quite an interesting process, the lengths they would go to in order to get a particular scene.
So that's extraordinary, because most of us would watch Top Gun and be blown away by the excitement, the peril of the flying. But you're saying that actually it was dull. Which character you were in the film and who plays you?
Well, nobody plays me. It was interesting. We got our hands on the script and we looked at it and we said, oh my God, this is terrible. We have to either run away from this or we have to fix it. And we assigned a couple of people, not myself, fortunately, to actually help them with the script to make it a little bit more palatable. So no, even though I did meet my wife at the officers club in question in the movie, I am not Tom Cruise, nor am I Maverick.
Well, I was wondering if you were Iceman, because of course Iceman comes back in the second film as a senior retired or senior admiral.
There you go.
And we should also say that you Substack and podcast yourself now on military matters with your son, LJ Winnefeld, and it's called Grey and Gritty. You're like the General and the Journalist of the US, we'd like to think.
There you go. That's one of the things that drew me to your podcast. It says, two people with potentially different points of view, different backgrounds coming together to have a dialogue. I think it's fascinating.
So the attack itself began last Saturday morning in the first hours of daylight in Tehran with this extraordinary decapitation operation to kill Ali Khamenei and a raft of his other senior figures as they met. It was an extraordinary intelligence success, wasn't it? built up through months, if not years, of intercepts and hacking in. And one amazing report in the Financial Times had the Israeli intelligence hacking into Tehran's traffic light system and video cameras, so they could spot where anyone went all of the time. It was under their grasp. And then we had two different militaries coordinating, the Israeli military and the US military, with a huge hundreds of targets, but with precision, accuracy, and effect. How unprecedented is the scale and ambition of that sort of operation, and how impressed have you been so far with the military execution of it?
Good question. First of all, I think there's probably considerable deconfliction between the Israeli and the U.S. Assets that were going in there. I don't believe the Israelis are necessarily integrated into our air tasking order process, that sort of thing. So sort of like you take Tehran, we'll take everywhere else, or something like that. So there was, at a fundamental level, some deconfliction that made it possible for us to be in the same airspace, essentially, at the same time. And we've done things like this before, but I don't know that we've ever done it on this scale. The Second Gulf War was quite an amazing operation, but the concentrated number of targets that were struck in the first day in this operation is unprecedented. And of course, those strikes came from a variety of weapons, including the media is very happy to point out that we copied the Iranian Shahed drone and used a version of that against Iran. I don't know if that was a cynical move or a necessary move, but it was quite fascinating to hear.
These are called Lucas drones, aren't they? One-way
Yes.
kamikaze drones, although that's not the language the Americans might use. I can't remember what Lucas stands for, but yeah, this is a real first, isn't it?
Yes, but it was quite an impressive operation. Now, clearly, we have some people are saying local air superiority over Iran. I would say we're pretty close to something called air supremacy, where we can fly at will over that nation and do whatever is necessary in terms of conducting strikes. And that the ground was set for that in June in those strikes, where considerable damage was done to the Iranian air defense structure. But it's going to be tough for Iran to survive this if they don't have any way of denying U.S. and Israeli air power.
Sandy, I wanted to try and set about answering the question that this episode poses, which is how does the United States win this? And if we go back to that planning process that you were describing, what may be a surprise perhaps to people who haven't been through this process is the level of rigor that goes into this planning, and in particular the amount of effort designed to describe accurately the mission to be achieved. And of course, that mission has to be related to a policy or a political outcome. I mean, I don't want to overquote Clausewitz, but of course he says war is a political instrument. It's an extension of policy by other means, but it has to be tethered to a policy. And it's fair to say that, certainly as an outside observer, we've got a variety of different descriptions of what that political outcome is and that policy. So could you have a go at describing what you think the policy, the objective of this war is, and then that might set us up to describe whether or not winning is possible?
Yeah, it's a really important question. I'm always reminded of Winston Churchill's admonition that it's always dangerous for soldiers, sailors, or airmen to play at politics. They enter a sphere in which the values are quite different from those to which they've thereto been accustomed. I love that quote, and I keep it in the back of my mind all the time. So I'm very, very cautious. But you're absolutely spot on. There have been a variety of explanations for this operation, ranging from the president himself saying this is about regime change to others, such as the Secretary of War, I guess we're calling it, saying, this is about taking down their air defense, their offensive capability, their nuclear program, and the like.
Iran has an ability to project power against us and our allies in ways that we can't tolerate. So whether that's ballistic missiles and drones, so offensive capabilities, effectively their Navy, which would attempt to set other terms and impose different costs, drone capabilities, which we laid out there. And ultimately, though, this tying it back to Midnight Hammer, the president has been willing to make a deal. You can't have a nuclear bomb. Radical Islamists can't have a nuclear bomb that they wield against the world. He gave them every single opportunity. Then we precisely took it away.
So there has been considerable confusion over precisely what the objectives were of this operation. And you're absolutely spot on that it's almost impossible as a military to conduct something like that unless you know the exact goals that you're trying to achieve. And I think, frankly, that may be one of the reasons why there are, other than international legal questions about this operation, why we don't have coalition partners other than Israel. I think people are troubled by what really is the legal basis and what is the actual objective of this, what you might call a special military operation, to be quite honest.
Yeah. So if we're agreed that it's quite hard to define precisely what's trying to be achieved here, I mean, let's take a different tack and think about the ways and the means. So famously, we all grew up reading and admiring Colin Powell. And of course, from his thinking and his writing emerged this doctrine that was, very influential for a while. And for those who don't know, essentially, he said a number of things. He said, first of all, that force should only be employed as a last resort. But of course, in this case, it felt like it wasn't a last resort because certainly if you believe the Omanis and the Qataris, negotiations were making some progress. Secondly, he said that you should only use military force or resort to war if it's in pursuit of a clear objective. And of course, we've just had the discussion that we're not entirely clear what that objective or those objectives are, with a clear exit strategy and with public support. And it's notable that there's been no real effort at preparing the American electorate or population for this. And thirdly, that you should employ overwhelming decisive force using every resource available. And it's notable that if one of the objectives is regime change, and that's debatable, it's very hard to see how you can achieve that if you're excluding any form of land component from the campaign. So I guess, do you think that Powell's doctrine still has validity and relevance? And what would he think of this? Would he think that what's going on is achievable?
Yeah, I think Powell's doctrine very, very much is in play, and it extends even before Powell. That you have to have those factors, the public support, the clear objective, the determination to win. It's very difficult to have a war in which you have one nation that is in total war and the other nation that's not in a total war situation. Now, if you look at what we're doing right now, excuse me, we are basically acting unilaterally. We don't have a lot of allies alongside us. We are not expending a lot of blood, although we've unfortunately lost a few of our soldiers. We're expending a lot of treasure. There's a lot of opportunity cost being spent in some of the very sophisticated munitions that we're using that are very hard to recreate, and pushing against international law. That's off the chart right now.
So let's get down into the mechanics of the campaign. I mean, you've been a fast jet pilot, you've commanded carrier strike groups, you've been deeply involved in planning, as we were hearing about earlier on, in the tank in the Pentagon. When you look at an air campaign, because it is an air campaign like this, what are the sort of phases? What are we seeing playing out, and what can we expect to see? Just in terms of, you talked earlier on about achieving air superiority as a first strike, but what are the phases that we think we'll see?
Yeah, so I think at the very, very beginning, you're trying to balance two things. One is hitting the very most important targets first to get those out of the way, and at the same time hitting targets that could threaten your force while you're actually doing that. So there's this balance between hitting air defense targets and actually the main targets that you're after. And in this case, it was apparently to go after the leadership of Iran, and not just the Ayatollah, but as you pointed out, a whole host of different people. And the timing, of course, was interesting. As you alluded, Tom, earlier to this exquisite intelligence that we must have had. I would refer you just maybe as an example, if you recall the pager campaign that Israel ran against Hezbollah. Think of that level of sophistication as sort of probably in play here, in them actually knowing when a meeting was being held of all of the senior leaders. And initially, the media and all the talking heads were very confused over why did they do this in the daytime? Well, it's very simple. Those leaders were meeting in the daytime. They knew where they were meeting. They knew when they were meeting, and they chose to strike there. And because they were confident about their ability to protect the force, that's why they did it in the daytime. So you're doing those two things. So that's kind of the first phase. The next phase is going to be kind of a sustainment phase. What are the other targets that are maybe not as important as the most important targets, but they're really important to us, like trying to hit Iranian ballistic missile sites from which they can retaliate against regional nations. And I would argue, even though they seem to be hitting nuclear targets right now, that those are actually the very lowest in priority because they've already been badly damaged. And this is just sort of a mop-up operation, I think, in that regard. So they'll be stepping through these phases, and they'll have things they're trying to accomplish at each phase along the way. And then to your very good question, how does this end? Which we should probably spend some time talking about.
Yeah. And while we're sticking with this operation, is there anything that you've seen that is new, that is novel, that is a new feature of warfare?
Obviously the drone piece is there. We've seen this in Ukraine, and it's playing out particularly on the Iranian side. Those Shahed drones, which are easy to hide, easy to make, easy to launch, and they can go a long distance, like 2,000 kilometers, are being used, and they're very hard to defend against. You can launch many of them at a time in a swarm. You can send them after many disparate targets, and a lot of people don't understand that air defense is very much a point defense kind of thing, where you don't like extend air defense over an entire country. You really have to pick your targets, and a lot of the targets that are being hit by these drones are areas that you normally wouldn't necessarily protect, like a downtown area in Dubai or Abu Dhabi or in Saudi Arabia. Normally, you're spending your air defense assets protecting military bases and the like. So this is something that we're going to learn from on how do you go about defending against these ubiquitous drones like the Shahed.
Admiral, let me push back a bit from a political perspective and play devil's advocate here, because you two, as both retired 4-stars, have grave concerns, quite obviously, that there is no very clearly defined mission here, and therefore, as military people, how on earth are you supposed to execute that? Some days, Trump says it's about removing Iran's ability to develop a nuclear arsenal again. Others, it's about removing a ballistic missile program or their proxies in the regions. And sometimes it's about complete regime change, enabling the Iranian people to rise up. I could put to you that this is Trump operating on a Trump-esque kind of way of doing things, which is not going down the traditional rule book, but saying, look, I'm going to have a crack at this as much as possible in the round. This is going to be very ambitious. We're going to throw a lot at this and see where we end up. And you know what? If I don't get everything, I'll declare victory anyway on half of it. So what he's really doing here is what a politician does best, which is leaving all his options open.
Yes, I think one of the things you're seeing happening here that actually has happened in prior administrations from time to time is a president saying publicly what he really believes and what he wants to say. That's why he uses the term war. He uses the term regime change. And then the staff sort of clean it up, right? And you heard Marco Rubio saying, well, the real reason we did this was out of self-defense, which is a very international legal concept, right?
We knew that there was going to be an Israeli action. We knew that that would precipitate an attack against American forces. And we knew that if we didn't preemptively go after them before they launched those attacks, we would suffer higher casualties and perhaps even higher those killed. And then we would all be here answering questions about why we knew that and didn't act. Going back to the purpose. The purpose of this is to destroy that missile capability. Why does Iran want that ballistic missile capability? What they are trying to do and have been trying to do for a very long time is build a conventional weapons capability as a shield where they can hide behind. Meaning, there would come a point where they have so many conventional missiles, so many drones, and it can inflict so much damage that no one can do anything about their nuclear program. That is what they were trying to do.
And it was kind of a circular argument, right? Where, well, we think Israel's about to do this. And if Israel does this, then Iran could retaliate. So we need to preemptively take out Iran. It's sort of an interesting argument there. But yeah, I think, and he's not the first president who has had to be sort of, I don't want to say reined in by his staff, but maybe context applied by his staff. So to an earlier point, I'm not sure, a lot of people were confused by why on earth would you note progress in a negotiation, as the Omani foreign minister did on a negotiation that happened in Geneva last Thursday, and then almost the very next day, a day or two later, conduct this massive attack. Well, I personally do not believe that they ever really intended for that negotiation to run its course. partly because they were very cynical about, the Iranians are skilled negotiators. They're going to drag this out as long as they can. We've seen this with Vladimir Putin, by the way. And they just, it's a lot easier to go after Iran than it is after Russia. And they just lost patience and decided to go do this. So it's almost as though Thursday was a pretext. I go all the way back to Pearl Harbor. If you recall, the day before Pearl Harbor, the Japanese negotiators were in Washington, D.C., acting as though they were very serious about negotiating. It's not unprecedented to do something like that.
Yeah, day of infamy. This campaign cannot go on for a long time. And there were reports in the media about Dan Kane, the current chairman, explaining some of the risks to the president. Now, we don't know if that was true or not, but there have got to be some concerns about magazine depth, and in particular for some of the very, very slow to produce munitions. Tomahawks, I think the maximum that can be produced is about 50 a year. I think Patriots, PAC-3s, it's about 500 a year. And when you look at some of the salvos and just the scale of the expenditure of munitions, this will come at cost. And there are going to be opportunity costs, whether that's support to Ukraine or indeed setting the theatre to constrain China in the Indo-Pacific. And so for a national security strategy that explicitly prioritizes the Indo-Pacific and hemispheric defense, how does this fit in? And do you think that these concerns about magazine depth are real?
Yeah, what you just said sort of strikes me. The Russians used to read our doctrine and completely discard it because we never followed our doctrine. Same thing can be said of strategy. I think there are two layers here, Patrick. One is the in-theater layer, where there's sort of a race against time. The munitions of concern are, as you point out, the more sophisticated munitions, although I wouldn't necessarily say that Tomahawks, at least in theater, those have been expended. It's really the air defense munitions, the Patriots, the AMRAAM missiles that are out there. Do we have enough of those in a race against Iran's inventory of Shaheeds and ballistic missiles? Who runs out first? There is a less sophisticated layer of munitions that is quite deep. So if you can really take out the Iranian air defense system and you have impunity there, you can use what we call dumb bombs with smart guidance, joint direct attack munitions and that sort of thing for a long, long time in this conflict if you need to. But we'll see. It's really just this terrible economic disparity between shooting down a $20,000 Shahed UAV, a drone, with a $4 million missile. You start to run out very quickly, and you'll run out of those Patriots probably before Iran runs out of Shaheeds.
Iran's Foreign Minister Saeed Abbas Araghchi posted this on Monday. He said, "We've had 2 decades to study defeats of the US military to our immediate east and west. We've incorporated lessons accordingly. Bombings in our capital have no impact on our ability to conduct war. Decentralized Mosaic Defense enables us to decide when and how war will end." Now, that sounds very much like the Iranians think you can throw whatever you want at us, but we're pretty confident we're going to stick around.
Yeah, it when you're taking on a country of 90 million people that has learned over decades to disperse its capabilities, it's a very difficult project, particularly if it's only done from the air. And nobody wants to see ground troops in Iran. That would be really a major escalation on our part, with fraught with risk. So he's got a point. That said, you would expect some sort of bravado to come out of the regime. They're not going to put out a statement that says, "Well, woe is me. This is terrible. We're probably going to lose." They're going to put out some sort of a form to counter what is being said by its adversary, to bolster their own people, that sort of thing. But there is an element of truth there that they have prepared for this.
Let's go into how we think Iran is intending to sort of prosecute this defensive campaign. And this war began with a decapitation event. And I'm struck with the potential parallels with 2003 and the invasion of Iraq, where in a parallel universe, had we been successful, and I think we tried, to decapitate that regime and strike Saddam Hussein, then actually we think that the Iraqis would have capitulated much earlier. And of course, what we're talking about here is this Clausewitzian concept of a center of gravity, the notion of the source of all power, the enemy's power, which can be a number of different things. In this case, do you think the calculus, either by the Israelis or the US or both, was that Khamenei was the Iranian center of gravity? Because if he was, it doesn't appear to have worked.
Yeah, obviously they went after as many of them as they could early on to try to decapitate more than just Khamenei, but also his very senior leaders. But if I'm not mistaken, in the wake of June, the Iranian senior leadership stipulated that there be that everybody who was a senior leader in Iran have a succession path of at least 3 people, because they knew this was probably going to happen someday. So it is a resilient leadership structure, and it's a very untested, at least successfully, theory that if you decapitate a regime, the people will rise up and overthrow it. That is not a very frequent case in history, and if you try to do it without ground troops, it's even harder. So the Iraqi and the Iranian case are very different in certain aspects there.
How do you see the Iranian strategy playing out over the next? I mean, if you were to try to get yourself into the mind of the IRGC and the leadership in Iran, is their strategy simply to keep surviving? And what's, what do you see playing out in front of you?
Well, I think the key to this is the president stating that he wants the Iranian people to overthrow the regime. If you're a member of that regime, a senior IRGC official or senior Iranian government official, that, I have a saying that in the United States, when we have regime change, it's called an election, and the losers go work in think tanks. In Iran or China or Russia, when you have regime change, people die. And so this is really a matter of survival for these people, and they'll do whatever it takes in order to survive. Now, if we had expressed our war aims differently and had not used the regime change piece, but had strictly said, we want to defang you, Iran, we want to completely destroy your nuclear program, you have to give, you have to agree to never enrich again, those sorts of more definable things, then they might not be quite as determined to continue this war as they are now, because if they fail, they're probably not going to survive.
Yeah. So this Iranian strategy, maintain control as a regime, but increasingly what we're seeing is impose cost on the region, impose cost on their Gulf neighbors, with a view, I guess, to trying to pressure the United States and Israel to stopping, and then more widely begin to impose economic costs through choking the Straits of Hormuz and increasing the oil prices. I mean, as a strategy, if they can pursue that successfully, that feels quite hard to beat. What levers have the United States got to defeat that strategy?
It's interesting at a time when we have been somewhat dismissive of our allies, that when you actually need your allies, maybe they won't be quite as interested in cooperating. So it has to be a strategy that's aimed at dividing what is already a very loose coalition. You wouldn't even call it a coalition of nations. In order to bring pressure on the United States. And you could use some kind of economic power if you needed to. That would be more of a coercive instrument. And I do think Iran is making a mistake, because until oil infrastructure and other things started getting hit, the Arab nations were content to try to do defensive operations only. But it may not be long before Saudi Arabia, for example, would consider doing offensive operations against specific targets that Iran could be using to target them. So we'll see. It's all Iran has at this moment, that and closing the Strait of Hormuz as a coercive instrument.
So that really begs the huge question, which we've really been dancing around here, which is how on earth does this war end? Because it's time limited on both sides to a certain extent. What do you think?
I think that the president very carefully laid the predicate for him to blame the Iranian people for not stepping up in spite of what he has done. And that's sort of very clever self-protection mechanism politically there. So one way you could envision this ending is that Oman and other regional nations, maybe Qatar, both of whom are close to the Iranians, step in and negotiate something where Trump is allowed to declare victory. And he can say, first of all, before he runs out of ammunition, as we talked about a moment ago, that would save face, some kind of a nuclear deal where Iran agrees to not enrich, to export anything that it's already enriched, and that allows him to blame the Iranian people for not stepping up and overthrowing the regime. Hey, I did what you asked me to do, what I said I would do in January, and you cowards didn't stand up and overthrow your regime, so I washed my hands of the whole thing. Now, there's a problem, though, is that Trump has said he does want to overthrow the remnants of that regime, and that's the regime that would be making this deal. And they're not going to be inclined to make the deal because they don't trust him, obviously. There is a question of when the Iranians run out of ammo. And what would they ask for in return? Would it be, okay, we'll give you your nuclear thing, but you got to lift sanctions on us, and you got to promise not to come after our regime. So it will take a while to get that done. And who's going to do the negotiating is a huge question mark.
And then you have to break down what regime change actually means, don't you? Because it would appear Donald Trump would certainly at times seem incredibly happy with just regime alteration, to use the phrase that others have now begun to use. So a Venezuela type situation where actually they're just bowing to Donald Trump's way now, and he'd be quite happy with that. But that seems incredibly unlikely. There is no, to use the Venezuela parallel, Delcy Rodriguez in Tehran who's going to happily step up and roll over, is there?
Right. So the regime transition, as it were, or as you might call it, leadership change, if you want to call it that, as happened in Venezuela, is unlikely to happen in Iran unless some powerful IRGC figure who has a lot of credibility and a lot of force on his side is pragmatic and steps forward and says, okay, I've got it. Stop. And I will negotiate with you. That is a possibility, but I consider it unlikely. And then at the other end of the spectrum is actual overthrow of the regime by the people. And as you know, it's the opposition in Iran is there, but it's very divided. And there is no, unlike in 1979 when Ayatollah Khomeini came in from a safe haven in Paris, a charismatic figure in a safe haven, coming in with a broad backing among the Iranian people and stepping into the vacuum. That doesn't exist. Reza Pahlavi, who is the former Shah's son, has claimed that mantle, but it's very unclear that he has enough internal or external support. And people, of course, in Iran are very suspicious of the son of a former monarch coming in and taking over. So it is looking through a glass darkly as to what comes next in Iran. And so it may end up being a face-saving piece where again, President Trump blames the Iranian people and accedes to some form of the current leadership staying in place.
And there's always the be careful of the what you wish for element here, isn't there? Because, the Iranian opposition, there's something like 6 different groups. Reza Pahlavi is only really representing one of the monarchists. Then there are the leftists, there are the regional separatists. There's a huge raft, and none of them like each other particularly. And unless the CIA is about to bring them all together and package up one person to come from amongst them and lead, and you may have a better idea of whether that's going to happen or not than we do, but that also seems unlikely. Actually, what regime change and the people rising up, if they even dare to, because the IRGC just mown down 30,000 of their friends and allies, even if that happens, actually, regime change could end up in a really horrible civil war.
Yeah, and I think that the opposition that did stand up earlier this year is exhausted. I mean, they were beaten down very badly by the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps, and they're going to be a little bit wary of stepping up. It's really murky, and it's a real tragedy for a civilization, a people who are actually very sophisticated, and ironically, who actually love the West for the most part.
Sandy, I'm struck by how much of this really revolves around the politics and the US politics as well, because I think everyone accepts this is an enormous gamble that President Trump has taken here, because there's really no way of knowing how it can possibly end. It could be this incredible success, reshaping the Middle East, or it could be an appalling disaster. But the question to why he'd want to take that gamble, I'm really still puzzled by. He's not going to get re-elected. Sure, he's got the midterms coming up in November, and he wants a couple of really big wins to shout about so he doesn't lose control of Congress, so he's not a lame duck president. But the other thing I'm struck by is this was unpopular in the US. I mean, tell me if I'm wrong from where you are in Texas, but a pretty obvious majority of the US population disapprove of it. 59% disapprove, according to a poll on CNN last night. So why is he doing it?
I would say that President Trump doesn't necessarily, he's not an idealist, but he does have an ideology, and one of those ideologies is survival. It is entirely possible that if he loses the midterms, yes, he will be a lame duck president, and he won't be able to accomplish as much as he wants to on his agenda. But it's also a real threat to him personally. There's no question that there will be new investigations opened up, potential long drawn out path towards a third impeachment. And that's the last thing that Donald Trump wants. So, and as you know, typically in the United States, the party in power and the presidential power loses the midterms. And he's, I believe, desperate to not let that happen. And if he maintained the same trajectory that he's on, that was probably going to happen. So this could be a bit of a desperation move in order to try to galvanize the American public behind him. Now, I want to be cautious about saying that because it's a little bit cynical to believe that. He did have reasons to do this. As somebody who watched hostages held for 444 days in Iran, 250 submarines killed in Lebanon, 19 U.S. Air Force people killed in Khobar Towers, countless Iranian terrorist acts. Nobody's going to mourn the loss of this leadership in Iran. But I do believe there, to your point, there is a very important element of that. And he is taking risks. He's taking risks with inflation. If oil prices maintain a high level over the next few months, he's taking a chance with his own political base, who is not excited at all, who actually elected him on a platform of no foreign wars. And that seems to be something, it's easier for a president to act on the international stage than on the domestic stage. And he's certainly been doing that. So it is a very interesting domestic calculus. And I try to steer clear of most of that based on my Winston Churchill quote from before.
And very well put. So look, as we move to end this conversation, it's been absolutely fascinating talking to you about all of this. Global chaos and conflict and Trump's operation in Iran very much fits into the trajectory the world is currently on, doesn't it? It is no longer the rule of law, it's the survival of the fittest. It's very much now the rule of force and the law of the jungle again.
Yeah, I subscribe to a theory of long-wave geopolitical cycles. And in the European context, which most of your listeners are very well aware of, 30 years war ends with the Peace of Westphalia, where statesmen try to put together a system where this could never happen again, because the 30 years war was very bloody. And then lo and behold, a couple hundred years later, you have the Napoleonic Wars, another bloody convulsion on European soil, where statesmen come together with the concert of Europe to try to prevent this from ever happening again. And then 100 years after that, you have World War I and World War II, which I kind of lump together. And again, statesmen come together to try to put together an international system to prevent it from ever happening again. And now we're 80 years into that system. By the way, the cycles seem to be getting shorter and shorter. And I think it's because of the ubiquity of information, the speed of information that's out there just makes these things happen. So you have to ask yourself, why do these cycles end? Because they end in a very bloody way. And there are a number of factors. There's usually a rising power that's very ambitious and usually authoritarian. We have that right now. You have a prevailing power that overextends itself financially, overextends itself militarily, and has deepening internal political divides. You could argue we have that now. And then you have successive generations that tend to forget the bloody cost of these end-of-cycle convulsions. And it's important for us to ask ourselves, without being histrionic about it or panicking, are we getting close to the end of a cycle? And one of the symptoms of the end of the cycle, by the way, is the rule of power triumphing over the rule of law. And we're seeing that in spades with Vladimir Putin's invasion of Ukraine, for one thing. So I think it's important for us to keep, and it's incumbent upon all of us, particularly the people who are senior in society, the political levels, to try to extend this cycle as long as we possibly can, because in this cycle, we now have nuclear weapons that could be very much a threat to our survival.
Sandy, I can't think of a better way of drawing all of those threads together as a close. And all of those themes you touched on, we've been covering in pretty much throughout all of the episodes we've done on this podcast. I think that that was a fascinating conversation and brilliant to get your insights as a former vice chairman. Thank you very much indeed for coming on the podcast. And I do hope you'll come back again.
Well, it's been a pleasure to be with you, and congratulations on having this concept for a podcast, which I think is a really good thing for the people in the UK and around the world to have access to.
Admiral, thank you. You're very generous, and we throw that love straight back at you.
Thank you.
So, Patrick, before we go, we've had a listener's question. Alexander puts this, and it's an interesting one this week. Alexander asks, how much muscle has the US committed to the region for Iran, and is Europe at significant risk of Russian opportunism? Strategically, it would surely make sense for Russians to strike whilst we're all looking at the Middle East. Patrick?
It's a great question by Alexander. I mean, the simple answer to the first part of that question is that the US have committed the largest collection of forces to the region since the last Gulf War. 2 carrier strike groups, and enormous quantities of combat aircraft and enabling aircraft. The second part of this question is more interesting. So I don't think we're going to see any conventional attacks from Russia simply because they're so busy being tied down in Ukraine and they don't have the capacity to do so. And of course, opportunism is the right way of thinking about how Putin might act. I think there are other ways that Russia could exploit this opportunity. The first would be something around oil, because oil prices are going to spike. There are going to be shortages potentially over the next month or so, and clearly Russia has got some leverage there. But it's also going to be interesting to see if Russia uses this moment to find ways of supporting, its fellow axis of autocracies member. We've talked before about how China, Russia, Iran, and North Korea cooperate. Up until now, when Iran has been under pressure, it's had, no significant help or support at all from Russia. But in a sort of sub-threshold sabotage, undersea cables, cyber attacks sense, which, of course, the Russians are doing pretty actively at the moment, you could see a spike where, it suits both Russia and Iran's interests. So it won't be a surprise that there's been a warning today from the National Cybersecurity Center, getting people to ensure that they've got the right sort of defenses in place. That's the sort of precautionary activity we should be taking. And the intelligence services and defense intelligence will be keeping a close eye on what Russia are doing, because Alexander's right. It's a moment where Russia could decide to act in support of Iran. What do you think?
Well, it's a moment where our attention is naturally elsewhere, so why wouldn't they try something? I mean, the only point I would add to that is just the sheer price of oil at the moment, $80, $85 a barrel. That helps Russia alone. The Russian economy and the entire war effort relies almost wholly on selling that oil, and they can sell it for more money. Putin's going to be a happy man.
Yeah.
Well, that is it for this week. We must end. As always, please do send us your thoughts to the General and the Journalist at thetimes.co.uk. That's our email address, the General and the Journalist at thetimes.co.uk. They're hugely valuable and we read them all. And until next week, Patrick, where I suspect we'll be talking about Iran again. Thank you.
Thanks, Tom.
You almost forgot to thank me.
I did.